So our next speaker is Kenyon Farrow, and Kenyon is the Executive Director for Queers for Economic Justice in New York City, and he is also co-editor of Letters from Young Activists and the forthcoming A New Queer Agenda and Stand Up. Kenyon is also hoping to start working on his own book someday soon.
I know, it's like 3 anthologies down. It's like, can I start, my own shit soon? In any case, good morning, everybody. I'll talk a little bit about QEJ's work, kind of how I see economic justice and repro justice, specifically from a queer lens. As a place of movement building work, and then also about the perspective of a grassroots organization. So folks who don't know, Queers for Economic Justice is based in New York City, and we do organizing, advocacy, research, and leadership development on issues that impact and with poor, low-income, working class, lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, queer, gender nonconforming folks in New York City. Our local work largely focuses on homelessness, and we do a lot of work in the shelter system, organizing support groups for queer folks in the shelters themselves, doing advocacy for folks in the shelter system, and then also doing sort of policy advocacy and change at the level of the city and Department of Homeless Services. We also do organizing of folks on welfare and public assistance who are queer and trans, and recently just finished a 2.5 year community-based research project that surveyed 202 low-income LGBT folks in New York City about their barriers to accessing welfare and public assistance and experiences of violence and in what context. And not only just asking the question, because a lot of reports that come out, this is how we sort of play the game to get funding often, is the damn is bad scenario, right? Damn is bad, look at this data, right? Damn is bad, right? But to also ask folks, well, what are you doing to sort of survive despite being poor, despite being low income? How are you trying to get your needs met? How are you trying to sort of mitigate the impact of various forms of either state or interpersonal violence, right? What do you do? So also asking people to share those stories with us in that document that'll come out this summer. So I think for us, and I think thinking about, for me, there's no way to look at sort of economic justice and reproductive justice as separate and distinct issues, because our country has, for a long time, really used poverty as a way to actually paint people as deviant, right? And often sexually deviant, and a way to sort of control people's sexuality, a way to control people's reproductive choices, right? Either to force sterilization, right, or forcing people to not have children, or to force people to have children and not have access to safe ways to not have children. And I don't need to go into the many ways that has happened. So I just think fundamentally, economic justice and reproductive justice are issues that are, and certainly queer liberation are definitely linked. Some specific, examples, I want to raise from our work. We've been working in the last several years on a campaign that lasted about 5 or 6 years in New York City with several other organizations, Housing Works, Audre Lorde Projects, Trans Justice, and Sylvia Rivera Law Project, to get the city to adopt some policies to make it easier for transgender people to be able to access welfare and public benefits in New York City. And, and so when I think about sort of the links even between sort of immigration and economic justice, especially thinking about welfare rights, the increased ways in which IDs are being used, or people having to have multiple forms of ID to access welfare and public assistance, has certainly impacted immigrants. It's impacted transgender and gender nonconforming folks whose IDs may or may not match what a person thinks that they see in front of them, impacts former prisoners, people who are homeless, people whose lives are for various reasons transitional, who may not be able to hold on to those IDs, and certainly impacts particularly poor women in the South, right? Because in the South, black people were not given birth certificates really until the 1960s and wasn't really fully instituted until the 1970s, right? So there are many people who don't have, I'm 35, I was born in 74, so a lot of people up until that point did not have actual birth certificates or were not given them in many southern states. So I think about, the ways these issues, are particularly linked. I also think about the impact of, I'll say this, a lot of the work of the welfare warriors have been doing recently is to be kind of building relationships and having sort of meetings and conversations with folks who work in either in doing work around the prison industrial complex who are queer, folks who are doing welfare work, and folks who are doing reproductive justice work, and are coming to also want to sort of critique the ways in which in many states access to documents for trans folks is tied to full quote-unquote sex reassignment surgeries, right? And that for poor, trans and gender nonconforming people who may not have the money to have those surgeries in order to change documents, or secondly, may not want to, right? May want to have children, and so may not want to go through those processes, but still identify as trans, that those advocating in such a way that that you are absolute having to get those surgeries done in order to access benefits, which is or access sort of ID changes, which is true in some states, is problematic, right? And so they are beginning to write and will be putting some stuff out, on those issues.